Picture a teenage girl whose only crime was believing in true love, dragged from her palace bed in the middle of the night, and beheaded for the sin of having a heart that belonged to someone other than the king who claimed to own her. Imagine being 19 years old and facing the executioner's axe because you dared to feel genuine affection for a man your own age instead of feigning passion for a diseased, obese tyrant old enough to be your grandfather. This is the tragic story of Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's fifth wife, whose youthful romance became evidence of treason and whose execution revealed the king's complete transformation from passionate lover into paranoid monster. What happened to Catherine wasn't just another royal execution. It was the murder of innocence itself, proving that in Tudor England, even a queen's heart belonged to the state. Before we uncover the tragic love story that ended with a teenage queen's execution, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because Catherine Howard's fate shows how dangerous it was to be young and in love in Henry VIII's court. Catherine Howard entered Henry VIII's court in 1539 as a 16-year-old girl whose beauty and vivacious personality immediately caught the attention of England's increasingly paranoid and physically deteriorating king. Born around 1523 into the powerful Howard family, Catherine had grown up in relative poverty, despite her noble lineage, receiving little formal education but developing a natural charm and spontaneity that made her irresistible to a man who had grown tired of intelligent, sophisticated women who challenged his authority. Catherine's childhood had been marked by neglect and inappropriate sexual experiences that would later be used against her in the most tragic way possible. Raised in the chaotic household of her step-grandmother, Agnes Howard, Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, Catherine had been exposed to the sexual freedoms and dangerous liaisons that characterized noble households where adult supervision was minimal and young people were left to their own devices. Her early romantic experiences included relationships with her music teacher, Henry Mannix, and later with Francis Dereham, a gentleman pensioner in the Dowager Duchess's household. These relationships, while inappropriate by modern standards, were relatively common among young nobles of the time, and would not have been considered particularly scandalous had Catherine not later become queen. Her involvement with these men reflected her romantic nature and desire for genuine affection rather than any calculated ambition. When Catherine arrived at court as a lady-in-waiting to Henry's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, she was completely unprepared for the dangerous political environment that surrounded the king. Unlike her more experienced predecessors, Catherine had no understanding of court intrigue, no political allies to protect her, and no awareness that every word she spoke and every relationship she formed would be scrutinized for potential evidence of treason. Henry VIII's immediate fascination with Catherine reflected his psychological need to recapture his youth through association with someone young and uncomplicated. At 49 years old, the king was suffering from multiple health problems, including infected leg ulcers, obesity, and probable diabetes that had transformed him from the athletic young monarch of his early reign into a bloated, foul-smelling tyrant whose rages had become legendary for their unpredictability and violence. Catherine's natural exuberance and apparent lack of political calculation appealed to Henry precisely because it contrasted so sharply with the sophisticated maneuvering of his previous wives. She laughed at his jokes, seemed genuinely impressed by his stories of past glories, and provided the uncritical admiration that his wounded ego desperately craved. Her youth and beauty allowed him to forget, temporarily, the physical and emotional damage that years of absolute power had inflicted on his character. The court's reaction to Henry's obvious infatuation with Catherine was complex and largely predatory. Experienced courtiers immediately recognized her potential value as a route to royal favor, while others saw her as a dangerous liability whose inexperience and lack of political sophistication could destabilize the carefully maintained balance of court relationships. Catherine's uncle, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, was particularly instrumental in promoting her relationship with the king, seeing in his young niece an opportunity to restore his family's influence after the disaster of Anne Boleyn's execution. However, Norfolk's support came with expectations and obligations that Catherine was too young and inexperienced to understand, setting the stage for the tragedy that would ultimately destroy her. Catherine Howard's marriage to Henry VIII on July 28, 1540, transformed her from an inexperienced teenager into Queen of England. But the relationship that followed revealed the fundamental impossibility of genuine intimacy between a young woman seeking love and an aging tyrant whose capacity for affection had been corrupted by decades of absolute power. At 17, Catherine became the wife of a 50-year-old man whose physical and psychological deterioration made him more monster than husband. The early months of Catherine's marriage seemed to rejuvenate Henry VIII in ways that impressed and concerned his courtiers. The king showered his young wife with expensive gifts, including jewels, gowns, and properties worth millions in today's currency, while his obvious infatuation with her beauty and vivacity temporarily improved his mood and made him more approachable to his ministers and courtiers who had learned to fear his violent temper. However, the relationship's fundamental problems became apparent almost immediately. Henry's physical condition made normal marital intimacy difficult and unpleasant for Catherine, while his psychological need for constant validation and control created an atmosphere of suffocating surveillance around his young wife. She could not speak to other courtiers without the conversations being reported to the king, could not express preferences or opinions without them being analyzed for potential signs of disloyalty, and could not even retire to her private chambers without her activities being monitored by spies. Catherine's youth and inexperience made her particularly vulnerable to the psychological pressures of royal marriage. Unlike Henry's previous wives, who had been older, more educated, and politically sophisticated when they married him, Catherine had no framework for understanding the dangerous world she now inhabited. Her natural spontaneity and desire for genuine human connection clashed constantly with the formal protocols and suspicious atmosphere that surrounded the king. The most tragic aspect of Catherine's situation was her growing understanding that she was trapped in a marriage that could never provide the love and companionship she craved. Henry's jealousy and possessiveness made it clear that he viewed her as property rather than a partner, while his physical repulsiveness and emotional instability made genuine affection impossible. She began to realize that her role was to serve as a living doll designed to make an aging tyrant feel young and desirable again. Catherine's attempts to find emotional fulfillment within the constraints of her marriage led to increasingly risky behavior that her enemies would later interpret as evidence of adultery and treason. She formed friendships with young courtiers who reminded her of the companions she had known before becoming queen, and she began to express preferences and opinions that suggested she retained some independence of thought despite her subordinate position. The court's reaction to Catherine's behavior reflected the impossible standards applied to royal wives in Tudor England. She was expected to be simultaneously passionate enough to satisfy the king's ego and chaste enough to preserve the dynasty's honor, politically astute enough to navigate court intrigue, and innocent enough to pose no threat to male authority, mature enough to fulfill her royal duties, and young enough to maintain Henry's interest in her beauty. By early 1541, less than a year after her marriage, Catherine had begun the relationship with Thomas Culpeper that would ultimately cost her life, driven not by political calculation or personal ambition, but by the simple human need for genuine affection and emotional connection. Thomas Culpeper entered Catherine Howard's life as everything her royal husband could never be: young, handsome, charming, and genuinely interested in her as a person, rather than as a political symbol or sexual trophy. A gentleman of the king's privy chamber, Culpeper was close enough in age to Catherine to understand her perspective while sophisticated enough in court politics to navigate the dangerous world of royal relationships, making him the perfect companion for a lonely teenage queen seeking genuine human connection. Catherine's relationship with Culpeper began innocently enough, developing from casual conversations during court functions into private meetings that provided her with the emotional intimacy she could never find with Henry VIII. Their correspondence, which would later be used as evidence against them, reveals two young people who had found in each other the love and understanding that their positions denied them with anyone else. The letters between Catherine and Culpeper show a relationship that was romantic and emotionally intense, but possibly never physically consummated. Catherine's writing reveals her desperation for genuine affection and her willingness to risk everything for the chance to experience real love, while Culpeper's responses show a man who understood the danger they faced, but was unable to resist the emotional pull of their connection. Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn, widow of George Boleyn, Anne Boleyn's executed brother, served as intermediary for the secret meetings between the Queen and Culpeper. Jane's motivation for facilitating this dangerous relationship has been debated by historians, but her involvement suggests that she either genuinely sympathized with Catherine's emotional needs or saw the affair as a way to gain influence over the Queen. The secret meetings between Catherine and Culpeper took place in various locations throughout the royal palaces, always under conditions of extreme secrecy and constant fear of discovery. Catherine would dismiss her other attendants and meet with Culpeper in private chambers, where they could speak freely about their feelings and their impossible situation. These encounters provided Catherine with the only genuine happiness she experienced as queen, but they also placed both of them in mortal danger. The psychological toll of maintaining this secret relationship while continuing to perform her duties as Henry's wife pushed Catherine to the breaking point. She was forced to show affection to a husband she found repulsive while hiding her true feelings for a man she genuinely loved, creating an emotional strain that manifested in increasingly erratic behavior that began to attract unwanted attention from court observers. Henry VIII's own behavior during this period revealed his growing paranoia and suspicious nature. His leg ulcers had become so painful and infected that he was often unable to walk without assistance, while his obesity and other health problems made him increasingly dependent on medications that may have affected his mental state. His jealousy regarding Catherine became more pronounced as his physical condition deteriorated, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance around the Queen. The end began in October 1541 when John Lascelles, whose sister Mary had served in the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's household, came forward with information about Catherine's premarital relationships with Henry Manox and Francis Dereham. This revelation opened an investigation that would eventually uncover the correspondence with Culpeper and lead to the destruction of everyone involved in Catherine's quest for love. The revelation of Catherine Howard's secret relationship with Thomas Culpeper triggered one of Henry VIII's most violent and destructive rages, as the king's wounded ego and paranoid fury combined to create a persecution that would destroy not only his teenage wife, but everyone associated with her quest for genuine love. The investigation that began with questions about her premarital relationships quickly expanded into a comprehensive assault on Catherine's character, her family, and anyone who had shown her kindness or sympathy. Henry's initial reaction to learning about Catherine's correspondence with Culpeper was a mixture of disbelief, fury, and humiliation that reflected his psychological inability to accept that his young wife might prefer someone else to him. The king, who had once proclaimed Catherine to be his rose without a thorn, now declared her to be a whore who had deceived him from the beginning, demonstrating his complete inability to understand that a 19-year-old girl might naturally be attracted to men her own age. The interrogations that followed Catherine's arrest were designed to extract confessions and implicate as many people as possible in what Henry chose to interpret as a vast conspiracy against his honor and authority. Catherine was subjected to hours of questioning about her relationships, her feelings, and her private thoughts, with interrogators seeking not just facts, but evidence of treasonous intent that could justify the executions Henry was determined to carry out. Catherine's emotional collapse during her interrogation revealed both her youth and her complete lack of preparation for the brutal realities of Tudor justice. She alternated between hysterical denials, desperate pleas for mercy, and confused attempts to explain relationships and feelings that were natural for someone her age, but treasonous in the context of royal marriage. Her obvious terror and psychological breakdown failed to generate any sympathy from her interrogators, who interpreted her distress as evidence of guilt rather than innocence. Thomas Culpepper's fate was sealed by the correspondence that proved his emotional relationship with the Queen, regardless of whether their affair had been physically consummated. He was executed on December 10th, 1541, maintaining his innocence of any treasonous intent while acknowledging his love for Catherine. His death eliminated the man who had provided Catherine with the only genuine happiness of her adult life, leaving her completely alone to face her own approaching execution. Catherine's final weeks in the Tower of London were marked by a dignity and courage that impressed even her enemies. The teenager who had been dismissed as frivolous and empty-headed demonstrated remarkable composure as she prepared for death, writing letters that showed both her acceptance of her fate and her continued inability to understand why loving someone could be considered a capital crime. The execution of Catherine Howard on February 13, 1542, was carried out with the same brutal efficiency that had characterized Henry's disposal of his other unwanted wives. At 19 years old, Catherine became the second of Henry's wives to lose her head for the crime of failing to love him sufficiently, her death serving as a warning to any woman who might mistake the king's infatuation for genuine affection. Catherine's grave in the Tower of London remained unmarked for centuries, another attempt to erase the memory of someone whose only crime was being young, beautiful, and foolish enough to believe that even a queen had the right to love whom she chose. The next time someone tells you that love conquers all, remember Catherine Howard, a teenager who learned that in Tudor England, love could be more dangerous than hatred and more fatal than treason. Her story reminds us that even queens can be victims when they're unlucky enough to have hearts that beat for the wrong person at the wrong time. If this tragic tale of forbidden love and royal revenge moved you, smash that like button, subscribe for more untold stories of love destroyed by power, and hit that notification bell, because the most heartbreaking lessons come from those who died for daring to feel human emotions in inhuman circumstances. What other historical figures do you think were destroyed by love? Share your thoughts in the comments below.